everyone. We'll get started here in just a minute.
All right, it's 2:15. Should we get started, Rich?
Yeah, maybe we can give people just a couple more seconds to get logged in.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Erin Shackle. I've worked in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education for the last 10 years here at the U.S. Department of Education. I'm currently on the evidence-based policy team within OESE, and I'm happy to be here with you today. We're talking about identifying evidence-based practices, exploring the U.S. Department of Education's evidence tiers and the What Works Clearinghouse. And I'm joined by my colleague, Rich. Hey, Rich.
Hi, I also work for the Office of Evidence-Based Policy within the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. And I've worked here at the department for about 12 years on various, mostly educator development grant programs prior to joining the Office of Evidence-Based Policy.
All right, so here, if you're in the Pathable chat, please, if you could enter your role on this grant. Are you the internal evaluator, an external evaluator, the director, a staff member? Please let us know. And then Miranda, are there results coming in?
Yes, we've got a lot of people responding. It looks like we have several project directors, a program coordinator for implementation, a student services director, an external evaluator, tribal liaison, project career counselor, another evaluator. So it looks like we have quite varied roles joining us today.
Wonderful, thank you. So Rich, you want to move on to the objectives? All right, so objectives for today. We were hoping by the end of this that you'll know where to find ED's definitions of evidence-based. Just wanted to FYI, when you hear Rich and I say ED, that is what we lovingly call the U.S. Department of Education. I'm sure most of you know that, but just wanted to make you aware. And we're also going to explore the What Works Clearinghouse, the WWC. We'll talk about intervention reports, practice guides, individual studies. And then my favorite, we're engaging in a learning culture among the OESE program officers, us, and our grantees. And we're so excited to be here. One thing about today, with engaging in our learning culture, is we realize that we can't hear your voices or see you. And so just as much as you can, please use the chat function. So I think we have a poll question, right? Does it pop up?
Yeah. So it should be on their Pathable tab next to the chat tab. There's a poll tab. And the first one is, are you aware of the evidence-based definitions? And that's intentionally plural. So I guess if you're only aware of one, then maybe your answer is no.
And Miranda, can you help us out again with the?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I'm giving them a minute to see where they wind up. Right now we've got yes, 41%, no, 59%. People a few more seconds. Yes is gaining a little bit of ground up to 42, 58. So it looks like we're maybe sort of close to half and half, but tipping towards no, the majority.
Okay. So that's good that we have a mix, and please ask your questions in the chat as we go through this, because we know, especially if this is new to you, this is a lot of information. So what we'll do today, and Our agenda is we'll talk about the federal framing on types of evidence. And by framing, we mean the ongoing discourse, the ongoing conversation as we talk about policies that require the use of evidence and as we build evidence. Again, we'll talk about EDs evidence-based definitions. There are two places where evidence-based is officially defined. So one is in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in the definition section, and the one's also in EDGAR, the Education Department's General Administrative Regulations, and we'll talk about that. Then we'll take a facilitated exploration of the What Works Clearinghouse. We'll briefly talk about other evidence clearinghouses. And then of course, we'll have Q&A, hopefully time for Q&A, but please ask your questions throughout in the chat, and Miranda, just keep letting us know if there's questions.
Great, so before we dig into the definitions, we also want to kind of set the larger framework for how we talk about evidence in the federal government and specifically the Department of Education. So we understand there's actually lots of kinds of evidence, and so sometimes people get narrowly focused on one. Maybe it's often performance measurement if you're focused on your DEPRA measures or something. But there's also foundational fact-finding, policy analysis, and program evaluation, which is actually probably where we will end up spending the most of our time talking about during today's session, is that fourth bucket. And just to kind of give you a scenario that kind of elucidates these four buckets. We have a scenario here. It's a quote unquote mythical OESE program that supports schools teaching in Native American languages. And so you can see in that first bucket, you can identify which Native American languages have existing immersion schools. And that would be just sort of foundational fact-finding, understanding what the sort of landscape is. Performance measurement would then be in this grant program. Maybe we're measuring the change in Native American language proficiency rates among the grantees' projects. And so it's just showing how well people are teaching the students to understand and use the language that their school is operating with. And then the third one would be policy analysis. So here we might be comparing different things. So for instance, we might disaggregate some of that grantee data by partial immersion or full immersion school type to kind of see which seems to have stronger impacts on Native American language proficiency, or maybe some other outcome, like student engagement or something like that we're focused on. And then the fourth bucket, which like I said, is where we'll talk a lot about today, is again, comparing things in order to determine just how effective the program is. So in this particular example, we're comparing the gains in the targeted Native American language between similar students from a Native American language immersion school and other schools. You also could compare other outcomes that you might be interested, again, around community or school engagement, attendance rates, those types of things, but basically between what your program is doing and trying to do versus essentially the status quo or business as usual.
All right, so the evidence-based definition. So again, I said that there are two places that evidence-based are defined within documents that we use. And the first one is from the Elementary and Secondary Education Act as amended by the Every Student Succeeds Act, so ESSA. This is section 8101, it's the definition section. And you'll notice that when we talk about this definition, there are four tiers: strong, moderate, promising, and demonstrates a rationale. And so for us within ED, we often associate this fourth tier, demonstrates a rationale, with having a logic model, since that's a way to link activities and outcomes. And you'll see when I show you the EDGAR definition, why we talk about it in terms of having a logic model. And then flipping back to those evidence slides that Rich just shared with you, you'll see the strong, moderate, promising evidence levels fall under that bucket. That's the program evaluation bucket. Demonstrates a rationale also falls there because it talks about positive evaluation findings, but you can also think of it, or it can also sit in the performance measurement bucket and those definitions of evidence. So here we put the definition from AD 101 from ESSA into this colorful table. Some of us, it's easier to look at for some of us. So here it's the 4 levels. And one thing I wanted to point out is for correlational study, you'll see we put an asterisk next to that. So back in 2016, after the ESEA as amended by ESSA was out for about a year, non-regulatory evidence guidance was published. And there's a bit more information about correlational study in that document. And we link to that document here. And I think it's provided for you in the files as well. And again, we know this is a lot of information. And so we hope that you use a slide deck as a reference as you move forward. All right. So EDGAR. So the second definition comes from EDGAR. EDGAR is the shorthand that we call the regulations that rule the U.S. Department of Education's discretionary grant funds. It's the CFR, which is the Code of Federal Regulations, and EDGAR is the Education Department's, remind me here, Rich, I don't have it written in my notes.
General administrative regulations. Yeah, we ended up
so if you compare the 3 slides with the last 2 slides, you compare the next 3 slides and the next 2 slides, you'll see that these EDGAR definitions of the tiers are less vague and more specific, but it's the same 4 tiers: strong, moderate, promising, and demonstrates a rationale. And then you'll also notice when you'll see the next 3 slides that there's 3 ways to meet these higher tiers. It's through a single study, through an intervention report, and through a practice guide, and we'll go through each. And I will say this again, but as we're talking about this, especially when we're talking about how to meet the 3 higher tiers, and you'll see it on the screen, there's a difference between entry and exit evidence, or how we talk about entry and exit evidence. And so for entry, we mean when you have evidence as you're applying for a grant application. And exit evidence, we're talking about while you have your grants, evidence that you're going to produce. All right, so we have another table, and again, this is EDGAR. This is from the EDGAR definition, and you'll see that it's less vague than from ESSA. So you'll notice on the left side, we talk about study design, the outcomes, the what works clearinghouse evidence rating, and that's about the design of the evaluation. And we have an asterisk here so you can look at the guide to learn more about the design ratings. And then in this last row, it shows the sample size. So in ESSA, it doesn't define the sample size, and in EDGAR, for a strong and moderate, it wants a sample of 350 or more and a multi-site sample. And you'll also notice on this table, we do not have demonstrates a rationale. It's strong, moderate, and promising. And so on this table, we're referring to meeting EDGAR with a single study. So again, as we're implementing the Evidence Act and looking to fund programs that will use a strategy or intervention that has evidence of effectiveness, more and more of our notices inviting applications, our NIAs, are asking for this entry evidence during the grant application process. And many programs are asking for the 4th tier, which isn't represented here, but that demonstrates a rationale, which is the logic model tier. But other notices inviting applications are starting to ask for evidence that meet the higher tiers. Anything that you want to add on this, Rich?
Yeah, and I think for the OIE programs, I think we understand that none of them are requiring any of these levels yet, and so I think we were asked to present today, just kind of introduce this to you all, so that I mean, as far as single studies concerned, if you're doing evaluations with your projects, you could begin to look at these standards and see whether it's possible for you to meet one of them. A correlational study really isn't that high level of a study once you start to break it down. So it might be something that you start at promising. And the 4 tiers exist not because one is inherently better or worse than another, but we just understand where the field's at and what is possible, because there are certain types of things that lend themselves better to one of the tiers more than another as well. So we're really just kind of trying to introduce these to a lot of the people, it sounds like, weren't aware of them, and kind of reinforce that for those of you who have seen them in the past. But one last thing I did want to mention, sorry, I didn't want to take too much time here because I know we have a lot to cover today, is that in the demo program, I believe it does mention that it's asking people to use interventions that are evidence-based, essentially where feasible, where it's possible. But there's another statement in there that talks about making those interventions essentially culturally relevant. And I think that's really important for the populations that you guys are working with, to understand that, like, maybe when you go looking for evidence that meets one of these bars, you don't have to translate it. You don't have to implement it exactly word for word how it says here. You should make it relevant for your populations, and the demo program specifically calls that out. So I just wanted to reiterate that as well.
Thanks, Rich. So this next table is, again, this is the Edgar definition, but it's meeting Edgar with an intervention report. And at this point in time, we think this meeting evidence levels with an intervention report and with a practice guide refers more, again, to entry evidence, proof as you're applying for a grant competition that's asking for higher levels of evidence. These are documents that you can use in that application process. Because this intervention report and then the practice guide, which is the next table, the What Works Clearinghouse produces. Anything that we should point out, Rich, on this and the next?
No, I think you pretty much hit it. But again, you can see kind of the descending requirements from strong to promising, in terms of how strong the evidence essentially is, or how clear it is.
So that's the intervention report, and the next is a practice guide. I'll give you a few seconds to read through this one. All right, and then, so like I said earlier, we'll go to the next slide. The department back in 2016 put together the non-regulatory guidance document. Did we advance here we go. Here we go. And you'll see, it's a good reference tool if hopefully you can access this. Maybe you've seen it before. You can see from this image that when people within the department were thinking about using evidence-based practices, they envisioned it as a 5-step cycle. You identify local needs, you select relevant evidence-based interventions, plan for implementation, implement, and examine and reflect. And here, for today's presentation, we're kind of sitting in this phase 2 of select relevant evidence-based interventions. So I think, do we have a poll question here? Miranda, does it pop up, or do they have to access it?
They just need to go over to the poll tab, and it should be pulled to the top. Is the next one, have you accessed the What's Work Clearinghouse before?
This one was, have you applied one or both of
Oh, I'm sorry. It was pulled to the top. Yes. If you go over to the polls tab, it should be right at the top. Have you applied one or both of the evidence-based definitions in your work? We're at 40 yes, 60 no right now. We'll give it another few seconds to give people a chance to answer. Just jumped to 69% yes, 31% no. Now we're at 71% to 75% yes, 25% no. So it seems like the majority have.
Thank you, Miranda.
Yeah.
That's good to know. And then do we go right into the next poll question here? And that's the one you were reading before, Miranda. Have you accessed the What Works Clearinghouse before?
Got it. So yes, now you should see, have you accessed the What Works Clearinghouse before in your poll tab? Right now we're at 54% yes, 46% no, so pretty close. Give it another few seconds. Oh, it's tied at 50-50 right now. It seems to be staying there. So it looks like we're pretty even. It just went down to 46% yes, 54% no, but still pretty close.
Well, that's great. I think it's helpful to know, you know, I think working in the department and working on evidence-based things, we don't always have a good view of what everybody in the field is doing. And I think different programs that we work with obviously have different rates of use and familiarity with these things. So it's really helpful to us to understand where people are at in the field and what you know, what what they're using and what they're doing. So the rest of today's session, or most of the rest of today's session, I guess I should say, is going to be spent kind of investigating and exploring the What Works Clearinghouse. And one thing I would invite you to do is go to the Files tab and click, I think it's the very last, at least on mine, it's the very last file on there, and it's the What Works, it's called WWC Exploration Guide. And I invite you to go look at that to see what we will be doing essentially the rest of the time. And you can actually take this document and use it yourself afterwards to continue to explore on your own. When we've done this in the past, we've actually been able to do it more as a workshop where we're getting a little more interaction with our audience, but please feel free to type stuff in the chat since I know that's our way of engaging today. If you have questions or thoughts or anything along those lines. I'd also invite you to go to the What Works Clearinghouse so you can see whatworks.ed.gov on the screen right here, and you can go there. And actually the first thing that you will see when you go there is a chart that looks very much like this. And I'm going to pull up these two things. So hopefully, can someone verify for me that they can see the What Works Clearinghouse and the exploration guide?
Yes, it looks good to me.
Great. Great. So actually today we're, because we can't do our normal interaction where you guys would be exploring, you know, we might do a quick modeling or introduction and then you guys would be exploring and we'd be essentially circulating and answering questions a little more one-on-one or maybe pausing for a whole group question. We're going to kind of do this live, and I don't know that we've done it quite this way before. So we're going to ask people from the audience to pick one of these topic areas, and you can actually see that at the top of this exploration guide, that is the first thing that you will do. And this table at the top of the guide mirrors exactly the topics over here on the What Works Clearinghouse. So somebody type in the chat what what topic area they would like us to explore today. Path to graduation. I saw 2 of those first. So Stacy, if we have time, maybe we'll do that one next. But we're going to start with path to graduation. So what you'll do is you click on this, and the reason why you might be you might be wondering why we started with intervention reports here on the Clearinghouse exploration guide. And it's because when you come to the landing page and you click on one of those topic areas, that's the first thing that they take you to. And so you can see here is a list of interventions or strategies or programs, I think different ways of saying these things, that the What Works Clearinghouse has reviewed. And intervention reports are essentially, if you're not familiar with them, you can see I included a quick 1 sentence about them here, but it's a summary of all the evidence and information on a given intervention, program, policy, or practice. And so as we're looking here, you can see anything that has this color, and so it's orange for path to graduation, and they're different colors depending on the topic area. That means they have positive or potentially positive effects. So already it sorts it for you. If you scroll down here, you can see here there's either mixed effects or no discernible effects. And then down at the bottom, essentially there's not enough evidence to determine whether it's positive, negative, mixed, or otherwise. So we're going to start with something that has positive or potentially positive effects. So once again, we're doing this live. So if somebody from the audience could quickly type in one of these interventions here that is in green, that they would be curious to learn more about. And you can see some of them are branded and some of them are a little more general topic areas. So anybody have an intervention they are curious about now that they can see them on the screen here? Let's see. Oh, it's hard to read the screen. That is great feedback. I will try to make it bigger, but we have check and connect is what somebody clicked. And if you're having a hard time seeing, that's why we gave you the link. You can kind of follow along. So again, the first thing we did is we clicked on path to graduation, and now we're clicking on check and connect. And I'll try to make this, see if I can make it much bigger. Unfortunately, it's going to make the other thing a little smaller. So let's see here. So when we click on this, the first thing you see is these 2 different things are the areas that check and connect was checked for. And so it was checked for children identified with or at risk for an emotional disturbance. As you can see, they reviewed this on October 11th, and there weren't any studies that fell within this category. This review protocol is what it's called, and met the What Works Clearinghouse standards. So again, these standards are very high, and so none fell in. So, but we can come check and look at dropout prevention. And now you can see if I click on this tab, there are some results here that pop up, and you can see on my I'll make this a little bigger right now to try to zoom in a little bit so you can see. And if you've downloaded it, you can see that the exploration guide kind of mirrors exactly what you would be seeing. And so it's really meant to walk you through and give you a chance to record and reflect on what you were seeing on the What Works Clearinghouse website. So, again, the content area under 3A here, that would have been path to graduation. B is the check and connect, is the intervention we picked. And so we would put that, you can put the link under B so you know where to go. And then down here, you put it under intervention name. And now when you come to 4B, we're looking at the outcome domain. And so here you can see it has been checked for 3 different outcome domains. So completing school, progressing in school, and staying in school. So obviously important things for a dropout prevention or frankly, path to graduation. And so if you were filling out the exploration guide, you'd essentially be choosing one of those domains that you're most interested in. And so we're going to click on we're going to choose staying in school. And so I'll happen to fill that one in. So the effectiveness rating is the next one. And all of these have this little I here. So if you're curious, this is a group of closely related outcomes. If you want to know more about what this is, it gives you the key for different, effectiveness that you might see. And again, this is the summary of the effectiveness. So it's looking at as many studies as they can find. As you can see here, staying in school has 2 studies, which is actually more than either of these, but you can see the differences in effectiveness rating. And what might be interesting to you is that, this has potentially positive effects, but this actually, they feel a little more strongly, the staying in school one has positive effects. So you can see it actually got a higher rating. And part of that, I believe, is because there are 2 studies that meet the standards instead of just 1. So again, you can see the effectiveness rating for that one, it would be positive. So then if you're filling it out, you type it in there. Let me pause real fast and check the chat, because some people said they're having a hard time seeing. And I'm seeing some people who wanted to look for some other things. So again, this is something that normally we would go through really fast, and then you'd be able to explore a little bit more on your own. But if you feel comfortable, you can go ahead and do that on your own, or do it after our session. So if you click on this, you can actually see the 2 studies that meet the standards. And so one is from 2005 and one is from 1998. And I'm going to close this real fast, so we'll come back to it. And the grades examined are high school, which makes some sense since we're focused on path to graduation, and dropout prevention is mostly focused on the upper grades. It also tells you how many students. And so as you may remember, the Edgar definition actually asked for a large sample, which was 350 students. So actually none of these studies, even combined, would quite meet that. So even though there is some decent evidence here, just with the Edgar single study definition, you couldn't meet it. But with the intervention report, it actually is looking like you might be able to meet it, assuming it's relevant to your population and everything. And then the last thing is, and this is now we're getting, so F was students, and G under number 4 is the improvement index. And this is essentially, again, when I talked about a summary, it's not quite an average. I'm not a statistician, so I don't know exactly how they calculate it. You can read here, but it's essentially an indicator of the effect of the intervention. And so, as you can see, one of the studies had an improvement index of 18, and the other one had 31. So this is kind of a little bit in the middle of those 2. And again, it's not like a perfect average. It sort of depends on, maybe the sample sizes and some other things of the studies. Again, it gets very technical once you start looking at that, but essentially the higher, the better, right? Like we want a higher improvement index, and many of them are going to be much lower. So that we're kind of just, this gives you a lot of what you need to know for looking at our evidence definitions. But if you want to read much more about, the intervention, it gives a quick synopsis here for Check and Connect, but you can click on the evidence snapshot, and that will take you to some information about essentially a more detailed version of what we were just looking at. It talks a little bit more about the sample sizes. So actually in this case, it was 78% male, which is kind of interesting. 70% were on free and reduced price lunch. This one took place in an urban center and in the Midwest. And so you can kind of see a little bit more about how the study was implemented. And then if you want to read even more, it gives you the full intervention report. And we're not going to spend a lot of time going through this. As you can see, it's 20 pages. So obviously it makes sense for us to read it here, but you can still see the same, this table looks very similar to what we saw before. And you can read much more about the program details, the cost, and all of the studies that are reviewed and all of those things there. So the last couple questions on the exploration guide are really meant to just get you thinking about your program and the extent to which this intervention is relevant to you. And then the last one is, what other research might be needed, right? Like if you're more interested in completing school than staying in school, or maybe you are more interested in children identified with or at risk for an emotional disturbance, then you would understand that there aren't a lot of studies out there, at least as of 2011, the last time they did take a look at this. And so you can see some of them are a little more outdated than others, because they are kind of constantly updating these intervention reports, or doing new ones, I should say. Every year there, a few more come out. And so you can see the type of evidence that's still needed. And like I mentioned earlier in the program, if you're doing an evaluation with your grant, this is an opportunity for you to potentially contribute to the evidence base. Even if it's not a requirement of the program, we certainly would encourage you to identify ways to add to the evidence base. So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to take a look at our this. Well, maybe what I can do, somebody suggested I close the Word document. And here I'll try to zoom in this a little bit too. Let's see if we can. I don't know if it's gonna let me zoom. There we go. Maybe this will help a little bit too.
So Miranda, I think you were asked how, you just responded, how you found Avid. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I was telling them I was curious when Allison mentioned it, so I just used the search box right on the main page, and the evidence snapshot for it came right up. So it's good to know the search function seems to work well.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point. And we're actually gonna after the next we're gonna go through. So we finished the intervention report essentially. I mean that is what an intervention report looks like. If you want to, again, we invite you to go in and look on your own as well and explore a little bit. We just wanted to kind of walk you through it today. But we're also going to look at a practice guide and some of the single studies. And I think once we get there, you'll see we'll kind of walk you through how to find some of those. And it's not showing up under Path to Graduation, maybe a little bit because the What Works Clearinghouse can, kind of has an agenda and they are responsive to the field though. So I think if you're curious and you contact them, they would, and they start hearing from the field that something along those lines is really popular, then they definitely are trying to be responsive. Obviously right now they're doing a lot around like distance learning or summer learning and things like that, given that we're in a pandemic and a lot of schools are either hybrid or fully remote. And so you can imagine they're doing a lot of those things. So the next step, and maybe I'll just do more toggling back and forth and hopefully not make people dizzy, is we're going to look at the reviews of individual studies. And actually the reason why we're skipping practice guides for now is typically for grant programs, if you're looking to find evidence, you're typically going to be looking at intervention reports or individual studies because those are on the actual interventions. Whereas the practice guides are written a little bit more for educators or practitioners. So maybe some of the people you work with, or if that happens to be your role, you might be curious about those. But those tend to be written a little different, and they're meant to be more translatable for the classroom or a school or something like that. Where intervention reports and the studies are looking more at reviewing it, a whole program or intervention that you might be choosing. So to find the reviews of individual studies, and again, they review these studies for lots of different reasons, as we'll see. But one of them is intervention reports. And you go back to the homepage. So we're back to the What Works Clearinghouse homepage. You can see this same, I'm gonna get Word document for a second, back out the same chart, but instead of clicking on one of these, because as I said, those take you to the, as we saw, those take you to the intervention reports, scroll down to the bottom and you can see here, you could also click intervention reports here. You click the practice guides, as we'll do in a second, but we're going to start here with the intervention or with the individual studies. And so when you click on this, it takes you essentially to the entire database of studies that they have reviewed. And you can see there are nearly 11,000. And if you come back in a couple months, certainly at the end of the grant competition cycle, you'll probably see a few more that get added here. However, what we're going to focus on are studies that have met. So actually first we'll pick a topic. So I think someone asked for teacher excellence. So we'll click that time. I promised we'd come back to that one. So we'll click on that. And as you can see now, we're down to only 528. So a total of 528 studies have been reviewed by the What Works Clearinghouse that fall under teacher excellence. And some of them might be cross-posted depending on what they kind of fall in. So so if you click on each of these, it might not add up to that 11,000. But we also want to find, so this is all of the studies. So some of these are going to not meet the What Works Clearinghouse standards. They might not be great studies. And so we're going to try to find ones that either meet the What Works Clearinghouse standards with or without reservations. And if you recall, these are the ones that could potentially meet the top two evidence standards, either the strong or the moderate evidence standards. And so now we're clear down to 78 total studies. And we're going to do one more thing. We're going to select studies with at least one statistically significant positive finding. You can click that. And guess what? We're down to 31 results. So any of you working with educators out there, this gives you some sense of essentially how shallow the pool of evidence is, at least in the What Works Clearinghouse, that meet these really high standards. And that was what I was talking about earlier, where, we're talking mostly about those high standards today, but the reason the other ones exist, the reason that these other ones exist are, because not every area has the highest levels. And so, there are other ways of demonstrating that your project is likely to be successful. Yes, and actually I want to pause 1 second to address Clarence's question. I think some other people chimed in as well. I think, fewer of them have likely been studied in rural areas. Part of that is sample sizes, right, are tend to be smaller, or it's at least harder to get into rural areas. But, I think if that's where you're working, we certainly would invite you to try to add to the evidence base in the rural areas. I mean, as you're going through, I don't believe that there is currently a filter feature for urban or rural, unfortunately, which would make it a little easier to figure that out. I would say it typically would be more focused in the urban areas. But that's also why I said at the beginning that, making these culturally relevant for the populations you're working with is one thing that is specifically called out in the demo program. And I think as obviously we try to be culturally affirming and sensitive to, essentially any of the populations we're working with, really, that's, especially important, I think, in your programs, and certainly would invite you to, use this as a resource, but maybe you don't need to translate everything in a very literal sense every time. So now we're essentially just going to go find a study, and this one is from 2020, and it caught my eye. So we're going to just click on this one about Universal Classroom Management Teacher Training Program on elementary children with aggressive behaviors. And if you click over to your, I'm going to take a second and click back over here, zoom in a little bit. So we've done all of these things. We've done 7. We've clicked our link. We clicked on a What Works Clearinghouse rating level. We did with reservations or without reservations. So we did both. And we actually did one more thing. We clicked one with statistically significant results. And then we found our study. So you can put your study citation, which for this one would be this Chang, Ranke, Herman, 2020. And we'll start to go through the rest of the thing now. So again, it follows very similarly with the other. I have a. Okay, can you go clean yourself up? I'll be right there. Sorry, I have my coworker here. So I might have to turn it to Erin for a second if I need to go help her. But so the first thing that you can do, we asked for is when this study was reviewed. So obviously this one's going to be reviewed very recently because it was only a 2020 study. So it was reviewed just a couple of months ago. And it also asks why the study was reviewed. And so this is a department funded evaluation. And so this one must have been likely one that came out of the What Works Clearinghouse. It doesn't say exactly how we funded it, but I think they tend to try to review all of the evaluations that we fund directly. Other things you might find here are grant programs. You might find that it was an intervention report. It was reviewed for an intervention report or a practice guide. It also, so the exploration guide also asks you for which protocol and review standards. So you can see 4.0 is the most recent one that has, I think they're in the process of updating again. They do this fairly frequently, but it's the most recent one that people have been using. And it asks you for what the rating is. So this meets the What Works Clearinghouse standards, which means it's without reservations, which means it's essentially the gold standard. It's a randomized control trial that, was very well implemented. So the next thing that the exploration guide asks you to do is click on this findings tab, and you can see that studies frequently look at lots of different outcomes. And so, for this one, they're looking at broad reading, and this one actually was not statistically significant. And so essentially there are indeterminate effects found. You can see up here at the top. We're not sure how much it impacted general literacy achievement. Same with general mathematic achievement. So I'm just going to keep scrolling because it claimed that there was one that was a little higher. As we're doing this live, sometimes you get nervous. Nothing about rate of observed aggression. But when we come down here to student emotional status outcomes, so essentially this is a teacher observation tool, it appears. Not one that necessarily I'm familiar with, but that is a place where that is the outcome, right? That's the outcome that they were measuring, the teacher observation of classroom adaptation. It's this checklist on emotion dysregulation. And you can see what they were comparing. So they were comparing this program, this Incredible Years Teacher Classroom Management program versus the business as usual. The period is essentially how long after the intervention they were measuring, and so this was essentially immediate. It was likely happening throughout, probably even. And this gives you the sample size, which again is important for meeting some of our evidence standards. And then the rest of these talk about essentially the size and scale of the difference, right? Like how effective was it? And so remember our other improvement index was considerably higher. I think it averaged out to about 25. It was between 18 and 31. And so this one's significantly lower. And so this gives you the intervention mean versus the comparison mean. So, people had fewer emotional dysregulation events, I guess is probably what's happening here, not knowing too much about this one. And it meets ESSA tier 1. It also would meet Edgar tier 1. And so this is essentially the highest, this meets the highest bar. And so if you were looking to something around training teachers to manage classroom of elementary children with aggressive behaviors, and this was the outcome that you were most interested in, or one of the outcomes you're interested in, you could demonstrate. go ahead and you can start drawing, okay? Nap just ended apparently. And so so this would be an example of a study that you could use to support your program. I'm gonna pause real fast. So I'm sure we have a bunch of questions. Somebody's asking how to compare the studies. So it's really hard to directly compare the studies. Thank you. Okay, you did a great job writing your name. It's hard to compare them other than you have to kind of go back out, you would have to go back and, you could filter different ways, but you can't really click on two at the same time. Now, all of these are teacher excellence studies that have, one of the top 2 ratings and have statistically significant findings. So, you really just need to find an outcome that is in, is something that you're interested in. But you can't really compare, I guess you could pull them up in 2 different browsers and look at them next to each other, but the system doesn't let you compare them directly, unfortunately. Do they talk about cost of implementation per student? That is a great question. Unfortunately, this is mostly looking at outcomes and not cost benefit analysis and things along those lines. But they do give you typically the studies and if you look at, I'm just going to click on one real fast, do talk about the intervention, and you can, great job. And you can kind of get a sense of what the intervention was. And so maybe you could talk to the people who have implemented it. Unfortunately, there's not a clear way. Great. Yes. And
when we talk about the other evidence databases, when we'll talk about that later, Rich and I were going through databases that are clearinghouses that other organizations have put together, some of which Ed has funded. And there were a few that have included the cost analysis as part of what they provide in the clearinghouse. And I can point out two later when we talk about that.
Yeah, and that's a great question. We'll probably move on here soon. I'm not sure how much time we're going to have for the last practice guides today. We've had some great questions, and so I'm going to address those. So I also want to address looking for AVID. So it might be better if you don't use the acronym, because you can see if you search, you can actually search here. That's what I was trying to show you here. And so I zoomed out for all topics, all ratings, all designs, and actually I'll even take that off. And you can see they don't, this is picking up David or Davidson. But here, it does have AVID because it used the thing, but it might be better if you type in advancement via individual determination, if that's what you're focused on. And it will, here you can see AVID program graduates. So you will be able to search for things as well under the individual studies if there's a specific thing, kind of keyword that you're curious about. Let me show you. Yes, Allison, I totally understand what you're saying about Ferraris versus a much cheaper car. And I think, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, there isn't an super easy way to do that. You will have to do a little bit of your own research outside of this. But I think this is really meant to identify, what possible interventions are out there that have some good support behind them. Maybe we will just jump on to the last part of our presentation, because we did want to cover it. And the practice guide, or the practice guides, it's a similar process. You scroll down to the bottom and you can find there. and kind of walk through it on your own. But also feel free to reach out to Aaron or me. You can reach out to your program officers and they can put you in touch with us too. And we would certainly be willing to walk through these with you at some other time. But we're running short on time, so we're going to jump ahead to the last section on the other evidence clearinghouses that are available.
So what I was just referencing is that there are other evidence clearinghouses that other organizations have put together, some funded partially or maybe sometimes fully by ed, others not. And so we found, Rich and I have been working on a project where we're going through as many as we can find, and then we'll present internally and figure out what to do with that information. I know we've talked to Julian about it before and his team, but here we found a link. One of our partners, AIR, put together a link of a number of clearinghouses that they found. And in that link, do people have access to that? To click on that link? I was just looking through our notes of our review. And
I can put it in the chat box, Erin.
It looks like Evidence for ESSA does a cost analysis in their clearinghouse. And then the blueprints, I can't remember the full name here. Let me pull it up. Blueprints for Health Youth Development. Blueprints for Health Youth Development. It looks like they provide a cost analysis. So that might be something to look at for those of you who are interested in who's doing that and how that's done. So again, Evidence for ESSA and the blueprints. And then as Rich and I are working through this project of looking through all these clearinghouses that exist, just this wealth of resources, and comparing to What Works Clearinghouse, we just created a number of questions anyone could consider when accessing a clearinghouse. Are the criteria used in the review explained? I mean, most of the time the criteria is explained. We have to click a lot to find it, but so if you're accessing these other clearinghouses, think about that. Is there a rating of the evidence and the findings? Do they talk about positive, negative, null, statistically significant, any kind of effect size? Are they referencing the Elementary and Secondary Education Act evidence levels? I would say for the most part, many of these clearinghouses existed before, so they do not. Does the site include systematic reviews or individual studies? Does the site include impact studies, like evaluations only, or are implementation studies or other forms of research included? Who is funding the project? Who manages the project? Some of the links that you'll find at that link we provided from AIR are published documents. And so it's just one-time static versus a dynamic website. And then with that, think about when was it last updated? And then what filter options are provided. And you'll find in a lot of these clearinghouses, they do provide many more ways to filter the information than we currently have on What Works Clearinghouse.
And it looks like there was a question about standards. So the question was, how does ESSA measure Native American cultural standards? And I think, not speaking specifically to those standards, but, as ESSA essentially, in terms of the evidence definitions, doesn't mention which standards anyone is supposed to or meant to use. And so, I think the key is really finding outcomes that they can certainly align with those standards or any other standards that you are interested in using. I'm not sure if that quite answers your question, but ESSA is, as you saw, it just says, an experimental study, a well-designed and well-implemented experimental study, and it doesn't say what standard, what standards that has to align to. And so, you know, in terms of ESSA. So Edgar goes ahead and mentions the What Works Clearinghouse handbook standards to make sure it meets those. But again, I don't know that those are, you know, I haven't done a comparison necessarily, but I don't know that there's a reason why those would contradict, you know, or negate, you know, most other standards, because they're very specific to, you know, certain things about, you know, how many people are dropping out of your study, you know, and things along those lines that may not be, you know, may not be even relevant, you know, related, I guess, to the cultural standards. And so those, I think, could still work in tandem most likely. Yeah, I'd certainly.
And I know that there's ongoing work with one of our equity assistance centers on ongoing conversations about evidence and evaluation and being culturally relevant. And I do know that's an ongoing conversation. I believe it's the Equity Center, Assistance Center that's out of the Midwest, out of Chicago.
Great. These are some of the resources and links that we referenced today. Again, I think most, if not all of these are in the Files tab. You know, once these slides are made available, you can also just click the links that are in here. But as you can see, it has the ESSA and Edgar definitions, the non-regulatory guidance, which even though it's now 5 years old, we still get told multiple times how helpful it is. You know, and some of the other non-regulatory, you know, some of the other guidance that we have put out to support people working with the evidence definitions. And that pretty much wraps up our day today. I'll pause here for a couple more minutes and look at the chat.
When I added on the second to last link, or the second and third to last links, are reference to that, the Evidence-Based Policy Making Act that I referenced earlier. We call it the Evidence Act, but it's much longer than that. But a lot of federal agencies are working to implement this act.
So someone asked about experimental studies, talking about years of rigorous research as a recognition for promising and practice-based interventions. So I think, you know, one spot that I hope that the department can also move in is, you know, experimental studies don't necessarily have to take years. A lot of them do, but there are things called like rapid cycle evaluations and things along those lines where, you know, and I think, you know, I think companies are probably running those on us all the time, and we don't even know they're happening. Like they'll send out links to, or they'll send out emails with 2 different subject lines and see who opens the email more frequently, so that they can learn how to better write email subject headings. And so that literally is going to be happening, you know, essentially in a day or two, or maybe a week. And so there are ways of running experimental studies on shorter timelines. It's a little harder in education, obviously, but I do know of some interventions that have been studied over shorter timelines. But Patricia, this is, you know, kind of, you know, your concern is what we were hoping to address a little bit in our comments earlier about how, you know, we recognize that level is, you know, as some people call it, the gold standard, but it's not, you know, it's not feasible or it's not realistic for certain situations. And so, you know, that's why the other 3 evidence levels exist, including one that's literally called promising. And so, you know, and that one's focused more just on correlational. And so you don't necessarily need, you know, quite as much evidence or comparisons or randomization that can be really challenging in a lot of contexts. And so, you know, I'd certainly invite you, you know, and as we are building, oh, yes. Okay, sorry. Yes, to be clarifying here, SAMHSA, NIH. Yes, some of their projects certainly are going to be taking long periods of time. But I think there are ways of doing things shorter, and also, you know, there are ways of finding studies to, you know, to build evidence base, right? I don't think we would expect you to go from not using any of these levels to jumping straight to strong, right? Like, we give you some examples of where to look if you're curious to find things at higher levels. Can you give me a minute? You know, but, you know, we would not be starting from strong, going from essentially nothing to strong. That would not be how we would plan to build a program or projects in space. So. Someone asked what the background is for the reviewers of the What Works Clearinghouse. So interestingly, you can actually find a list of people who have taken the, let's see if I can find it in real time.
I did, I posted the link.
Oh, you posted the link, great,
Yeah.
thank you.
And the link, it's in the thread. I can, if it needs to be posted publicly, we can do that, but it's a link to both the public list of the reviewers, but also how to become a reviewer if you want to go through the training and become certified and become a reviewer.
All right, we know we're going to get kicked out here soon, but we'll stick around just to see if there are any last questions. So you can also like to make these reminders for you.
I mean, I think to end, we just, you know, these ongoing conversations, please have it with your program officers, and we're happy to join meetings, look at any emails, have these conversations, connect with What Works Clearinghouse, and have these ongoing conversations about evidence and evaluation. So please just keep the conversation going. We're, you know, we're trying to build the evidence base, but also honor everyone's different context.
Thank you so much, Rich and Erin. Based on the chat box activity, I think all our participants found this session as informative as I did. I know I really enjoyed getting to go into the Clearinghouse live and explore it with you a bit. We have about 8 minutes left. If anyone has more questions, if you hop out early, we ask that you please complete our 5-star rating poll in that polls tab before you go. We do look at and use the feedback, and we really appreciate you taking the time to do that. And then our next sessions will be starting shortly, and you can also join Rich and Erin again a bit later today for their networking session at 5:15 p.m. Eastern.
I think one other thing I'll say, are we still live, is and within Ed, we're the only program office, right, Rich, that has an evidence-based policy team. So
that's correct, and literally our job is to support.
Yeah. We're here to support discretionary and our formula grants as we implement the Evidence Act. So please, do not hesitate to reach out to your program officers, and Jillian and team will reach out to us.
We're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat box. I'm not seeing any more questions come in though.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and yeah, we appreciated your participation, and and we'd love to continue to support you in the future. So.
Thanks so much, Rich and Erin. We appreciate it. Great session.